Sí.
Arriba.
Buenos días. Disculpen, pues es un honor tener aquí al profesor Noam en el marco de los seminarios que estamos celebrando en el Cide, los 40 años del Cide. Tendremos a lo largo del año una serie de seminarios y pues no puede ser más oportuna la presencia del profesor Noam en el contexto de la discusión de las leyes secundarias de la reforma de telecomunicaciones en el Congreso. Les platico del Noam, es doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Harvard, también tiene doctorados honorarios de la Universidad de Múnich y de la Universidad de Marsella. Es profesor de Economía y Finanzas en la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad de Columbia y es Garrett Professor de Public Policy and Business Responsibility. También ha impartido clase en el Departamento de Derecho de Columbia, en el Departamento de Economía y en la Escuela Woodrow Wilson de Princeton, en Universidades Generales, y ha publicado 30 libros y más de 300 artículos en revistas de Economía, Derecho y otras revistas interdisciplinarias. También es columnista regular del Financial Times, ha sido asesor para los gobiernos de Suecia, Irlanda y Estados Unidos, y también presidente del Consejo de Asesores de Tecnologías de la Información en la Casa Blanca. Actualmente es director en jefe de Columbia Institute for Technical Information y de la International Media Management Academic Association, miembros del equipo de asesores del Federal Government Telecommunications Network, del National Computer System Laboratory, del National Commission on the Status of Women in Computing, del Governor Task Force on New Media y de Internet Corporation. Entonces, como ven, es un experto en el tema por muchos años. Además, ha acompañado a Telecom Cide desde su inicio, ha estado con nosotros visitándonos en el Cide en varias ocasiones y de hecho tengo que agradecer el departamento que él tiene con el Institute for Technical Information. Fue una inspiración para crear Telecom Cide en México. Muchísimas gracias, Eli, por estar aquí. Tendremos, creo que como 15 minutos faltan, seguramente se me salgan los audífonos si alguien quiere para la traducción. Y después abrimos para comentarios del profesor Judith. Alexander, muchas gracias por estar aquí y gracias a todos por venir.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here, and I do apologize to those of you whose English is not as good as my Spanish, or vice versa, but will be able to hopefully understand Rebecca as the interpreter in the back. And I'm particularly pleased to come here and escape the winter in New York, but also to come here and arrive at a time when the media ownership and concentration issues are at the forefront of policy discussion, in newspaper discussion in your country. I want you to know that these discussions have been noted around the world. People have taken note of these kind of extraordinary reforms that were instituted 1 year ago, and the institute that was created and the mandate that this institute was accomplishing. So we are all extremely impressed by what your country has produced, particularly in comparison to the very difficult political situation in Washington where the two major parties cannot agree on anything and therefore policy is not being developed. Now, I do understand, and I was speaking yesterday also at the Senate here in this impressive new building, that there is a backlash, a government bill that is trying to modify the particulars of the reform. These are important discussions that are taking place right now, and it gives me therefore great honor to come here and to speak on a related subject. Now, I will say no modesty that I'm here, this is my third day here, and the last thing you need is somebody from New York coming here to tell you what to do in Mexico. That is not my aim, although if you ask me, I will kind of try to give an answer. But my major purpose is really to show the situation in Mexico in the global context of how media in other countries are operating and what the media concentration realities and trends and drivers are in other countries. And that is an important task because one has to differentiate between general global trends that are based on the opening of trade, that are based on digitalization, on technology, on the internet, and so on. Those trends are very difficult for any government to deal with. They're not country-specific. They're not kind of secular fundamental trends. Governments can try to deal with them, but that is usually a more difficult task. In contrast, there are these differentiators that are country-specific, where you look at a country and says, we would expect this, but they're really there. Or we expect something here, but they're really there. What are the reasons? And if we identify those factors, then possibly we can deal with reforms concerning those particular situations, because then they deal with government policy, with a particular media company, or with other inherent factors, with other factors that affect this country. So I'm very pleased, as I said, to be here and to participate in this discussion. And I will start with since many of you here are students, I will put on my professorial hat. And since also this is my last week of teaching for this semester, my semester is over, you still have to work here very hard for a while. We're done next week. So I will ask you that question by way of preparing you for your general examination. And that is, who is the largest owner of media in the world? Does anybody have courage to venture a guess that? Murdoch. All right. Any other guesses? Just a little collect. Diego has heard this one 3 times. So you have any other takers? Well, usually the answer is in fact kind of, usually people will say it's Murdoch or Berlusconi or some Redstone or some of these big media moguls. All right, but the answer actually is different. It is the government of China. It's the government of China because the Chinese government owns all of its television, most of its radio, all of the newspapers, most of the magazines. It's all under one system of control. Sometimes there are several levels, several ministries, but ultimately what the Politburo and the Central Committee decide what will be in the paper and who runs the paper ultimately governs. There might be some kind of temporary autonomy that you can report in local matters in a decentralized way, but ultimately the appointments, the heads of these media organizations are all appointed by this body, and it's quite extraordinarily large. So let me then kind of proceed to the next question. Who are the largest private media owners in the world? Now we're getting closer to Murdoch, but I can tell you already, it's not going to be Murdoch. Okay. So any guesses here too? Here too, you're in good company because nobody gets that. This is the largest media owner in the world, and this is the second largest media owner in the world, and this is the third largest media owner in the world. And you might ask the question, who are these? And the answer is these are hedge funds, these are banks, holdings, mutual funds, private equity funds, the institutional owners, and they own $5 billion in Google and $2 billion in Microsoft and $3 billion in CBS and $4 billion in here and there. In fact, BlackRock owns a certain share of Carlos Slim's operations. I don't know if it's Group of Cars or Telemex or whatever, but one of these entities of Slim has a certain several $1 billion worth of American institutional money. And therefore, these people who actually own these media, although not in a managerial sense, but in an equity ownership sense, are people you have never heard of before, and people in New York have never heard of them before, even though they kind of tend to live there. There's people like Joseph Hooley, right? And F. William McNabb III. Okay, those are the people who control the funds, who control these media organizations. Now, if I expand my question now to the next now, okay, so who are the largest personal owners, not institutional, like, individual or family who owns the largest? And media includes telecom and internet and so on. Who is the largest? And here you will recognize the man, okay? It is the largest individual owner. So Carlos Slim, in other words, is not just large in Mexico. He's large globally. And the numbers that I come are actually much lower than the ones that a magazine like Forbes magazine that every year, kind of the richest people in the world, and I think they give him about $70 billion. And kind of my numbers actually come out lower because I only count the media, not the industrial holdings, and also because I think that the Forbes isn't quite accurate. But I come here, I'll show you my numbers. That kind of Slim here is 29.2 billion in media ownership, whereas the, let's say, State Street has more than twice as much, and Vanguard and Fidelity is similarly. But of individual owners, this is the largest and the largest by far. But still, it is dwarfed by the value of the media holdings of the Chinese government. And those numbers are going to be increased, in fact, these Chinese numbers, because as the country becomes richer and there's more advertising, the value of these media companies is going to increase even if there's no change in the ownership itself. Now, so to the next question would be, who then are the largest and most powerful media organizations in the world? And companies are not owned. And here, there are different ways of identifying what largest mean. The first way to define largest is by revenue. Who has more revenue in the world, and kind of sales, annual sales. And now we're getting to indeed to money. Okay, so Murdoch's company, or really companies, because similar to Carlos Slim, there are now several organizations, but they're all owned and controlled by the same person, which is Rupert Murdoch and his sons. They are, and so you can see that that's kind of the largest. Now, Murdoch kind of owns only a certain percentage of that company, not all of it. In fact, one of the characteristics of media companies is that often in the content side, in the mass media side, like film, TV, that kind of stuff, newspapers, companies are owned, controlled by somebody who does not actually have the majority of shares, because there are different categories of shares. So Murdoch, for example, owns, 20 or 30% of the shares, but they have super voting rights. And so his 20 or 30% can give him a majority, even if he doesn't have all the shares. And that is quite frequent in the media field. It is true, for example, that Silvio Berlusconi, who is the huge owner of television in Italy, he owns only a certain percent of his companies in very complex arrangements. The New York Times is owned by the Sulzberger family, but they also own a certain small percentage of the actual shares. And I could go on and on. So these are the largest companies, and you see that Google right there is actually already number 2. And actually my expectation is that at this time, because these numbers are, they're probably 2012 numbers, that by now Google might well be number 1. And then comes the government of China. It is not the top because China is a poorer country. Viacom, an American New York-based company, Bertelsmann, a German company, Time Warner, a New York company, you have Liberty Media, and so on. Okay, now, there's another way of defining largest. There's another way of defining largest, and that is by kind of trying to say, look, what we're really interested in is not so much music and whether it's video games. We're really most interested in news because that's what gets into people's head, that shapes it. It shapes politics, it shapes voting behavior, it shapes attitudes. So the news are really more important than the entertainment. So if you just look at the news, we identify ownership control in the news, but within the news we can do it in two different ways. One is just looking at dollar numbers, revenues, but that would not capture, for example, in China, how much the government owns, because the revenue is not the issue here. It's really about the time that people spend on your news that you provide. This is what we call this attention time. And if you go over and kind of measure attention time and compare it, what we find here is, it's a little hard to read. I do apologize, I should change that graph, but you can see here in the top line, it says Government of China, and you see the number 18.96. And that means that the share of the Government of China in the overall global, worldwide news attention by hour is 20%. 20% of humankind's offices, billion people or so, news attention is controlled by the government of China. Obviously, mostly China. Still, it's just gigantic. And then comes the public broadcaster in India. Again, it's kind of a huge country, lots of population. Then comes the government of Russia. Then comes the government of Egypt. And then, if you move on, we start to see private companies in global. Sorry, back up. Global, which is the Brazilian largest media group in Brazil, it's the De Novo family. Kind of has a very large share of private companies, but look at the worldwide attention share is only 1%. Even so, the fourth or fifth largest in the world has only 1%. So compare this, say, to China. Then comes an Indian group, BCCL, and then the next is Grupo Televisa. So they are larger in news attention than Disney in the United States, than Comcast, then CBS and Viacom in the United States, then Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, and other companies, and certainly larger than TV Azteca, which is also fairly large. The intuition here is to say, how come they're so large? And the answer is a very simple one. Now, Mexico is, population-wise, a pretty decent-sized country. The United States is 3 times as large, true, population-wise, but there's no company that has a market share like Televisa has. So, I mean, if you have a news attention, the largest company here, what is it? Murdoch Group is for the entire world, including Australia and UK. So, but if we have a more specific American company, let's say Disney, they have only 1% worldwide, because in the United States they might have, in terms of news attention, at most 7 or 8%. So you see how extraordinarily large, actually, the attention, news attention share of Televisa is in worldwide comparison. And I want to make several things clear here as I progress. The first one is this study was not about Mexico. This study was about the world. Then I got invited. Thank you very much, Commissioner Lamborghini. And thank you very much, Judith. I'm really honored to be here in Nevada, especially Mariscal, to this very, very great university I've been in twice before. It's a great program, and I'm truly happy you're lucky to have this kind of program here. So this is not done in order to make some advocacy about Mexico. I'm just reporting the numbers. I highlight the Mexican numbers because they're obviously the most interesting to you. Secondly, there is no company behind any of this, so this is not sponsored research by anybody. Now, because it can go on for hours. Okay. All right. So, okay. Now comes the third category of measurement, and that is the kind of looking at companies by market power. And here in market power, economists measure this by something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI, which basically is the squaring of the market share. And what we've defined is a market share of a company multiplied across the different media industries in a country and then aggregated across the world and always weighted by the size of the country, the size of the industry. And if we do this, you will see here on the left, the blue line is Google. And Google is so much larger than anybody else. It's just amazing, astonishing. Google is not by revenue the largest company in the world, and certainly if they have become the largest, only barely so. But they have market shares everywhere that are 60, 70, 80, 90%. And so if you look at that aspect worldwide, you see that Google is just off the charts. And one of the problems for public policy is, what are you going to do about that if this is a problem? In the olden days, when a television network had too much power, you could perhaps cut it down or restrict it. Or Telecom, you could do all kinds of regulatory matters, policies. But when Google, the search engine, and the web service, and the advertising service become so dominant, the options for government regulators and government's legislators to deal with it are very, very limited, because it's not so easy kind of to find some solution. Okay, now let me kind of move a little faster here, because I hear it's breathing down on me. So our study kind of covered 80% of the world by population, 80% of the world by GDP. We use different indices. Here's kind of, this is the definition of the HHI. This is another definition of, I think I would kind of ignore this with the reasons of time. One thing that, for those of you in the communications field, should be kind of really interesting is to see how large the media sector is, how very large the media sector is, in the entire economy. I'm not talking about influence, about politics, about culture, but just simply as an economic entity, how large it is. So the consumption of media content is about 4.7 billion content, just content, $4.7 billion, 4.7 gross world GDP. When it comes, content as well as platforms, which is telephone and cable TV and so on, as well as devices like iPads and so on, is about 4.7%. If you add to that the retail revenues and so on, you get to about 5.9% of the world GDP. That is already fairly high, but it is actually even higher if you consider only discretionary spending, because much of media consumption is discretionary. It's not like food, it's not like shelter, it's not like medical, it's not like education. So if you subtract those components from overall income and just look at the discretionary income, then you will find that the numbers are, let's see, sorry. That the numbers of the percent of media and discretionary spending about 20%. That's already very, very large. It's even larger if you measure it by time. According to the United States government, people spend media time approximately 3,500 hours in the United States on media consumption. Now, this could be background music and so on, but nevertheless, 3,500 hours a year. If you therefore kind of look at overall people when they're not asleep and not working, you have only about 60% of people's non-sleeping, non-work time is accompanied by some form of media consumption. So we're talking about a really important sector, and we're talking about a sector who, if they're controlled by only a few people, is just an extraordinary influence. 60% of their time are spent with some media. Therefore, if one or two companies control those 60%, you can imagine what an impact that might have. Now, I'm going to skip some of these things here and move to the question. Are the world's media becoming more concentrated and less in the world overall? And if I look at that, we have to differentiate between content media and platform media. And the content media have increased in concentration significantly in the last 10, 15 years. On the annual average in the world, average media industry, by approximately 3.1%. That's a very large, high rate of growth. For the platform media, telecom, cable, internet, ISP, it has gently declined at the same time. And what are some of the reasons why different industries are concentrated in different ways? And there's one basic factor, and we've tested a whole bunch of factors, but the most dominant factor is the capital intensity, the amount of capital money you have to put into machinery, equipment, software writing at the beginning, and so on, as opposed to operating costs while you operate media companies. And so if you look at this particular graph, it will show you the intuition behind my observation, which is that horizontally you have capital concentration, you have capital investment intensity, and on the vertical you have the media concentration. And what you look at that, what you observe is that the higher the capital intensity of media are, the more concentrated that media becomes. This is a very important observation. I want you to understand what the implications are. It means that as media are becoming more capital intensive because of technology, there's more machinery, there's more equipment, there's more electronics, in contrast say, to newspapers and magazines, the more you technologically advanced media become, the more concentrated they become. And that means that as we move to an internet-based media system, you should expect a greater concentration of media rather than a lesser concentration of media. I'll show this to you in another way. This organizes here for 5 or 6 regions of the world how media are concentrated, whether they're old media, print, say, or 20th century media, the red bar, that's kind of TV and film and radio, versus the blue bar, which are internet media. And what you see is that the newer media are more concentrated than the old media. Now, this is important to understand because many people believe and have always heard it, and it's the conventional wisdom, that the internet will be the solution to the media control and power issue, because after all, everybody can have a blog, and everybody can put pictures on, and there's Twitter, and there's this and that. And that's true. That is the so-called long tail. But at the other extreme are these companies that have acquired a very significant market share in their particular niche. I gave you already the example of Google, its market share, or Amazon, or Netflix, or eBay, or YouTube. Wherever you look, these new companies, after some early stages in which they compete and contest with each other, somebody emerges and the dominance emerges because there's these high fixed costs, these very low marginal costs, the huge economies of scale. And these economies of scale mean that there will be some winners. And typically the market shares in internet industries are higher than they are in non-internet industries. Even though you do have these blogs there, it's true, but in terms of overall participation, market share, it's not true. Therefore, people start out with the idea of the internet is the solution to the problem. And you come to the conclusion, no, the internet is the problem, or at least it's part of the problem. This goes against the conventional wisdom and the ideology of the internet, which is often kind of held by people who sometimes don't have a historic perspective, don't have economics, and think just because it's new Therefore, economics are going to be suspended. And everybody can. Thank you. Okay, I think I'm over my time now, so I can't really do this. Just to show you what I'm doing. Okay, now I want you to show where Mexico stands. Okay. All right. Okay, so if you look at the worldwide kind of overall, all these 30 countries that we focus on, just the content media, if you have a very good eyesight, which most of you probably have, still in college, you will see here that Mexico is fairly far over to the left, which means that more concentrated are China government, Egypt government, Russia government, South Africa, a lot of government, Ireland, for some weird historic reasons, and then Mexico. In other words, of all these countries, Mexico is the most concentrated, except for Ireland, if you disregard those state-owned authoritarian countries. If you do the same thing for platform media, platforms, telecom, ISPs, cable, mobile, you will see that Mexico actually ends up to be the second most concentrated country in the world, right after Russia. If you look at the dominance of the largest company in each market, the single largest company, Mexico is number 5, and only again China, Egypt, South Africa, Ghana, and Turkey are more concentrated. And now, skip a lot of stuff. Now I've got one more thing, okay, which is when you show these bars that I showed you, then people will say correctly, but you're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing a small country with a large country. And of course, a large country would have more media companies because there's a bigger market. A richer country will have more media companies because there's more advertising, more for consumer market. People will pay more, so how can you compare them? So we've adjusted for all of these factors. All of these factors have been adjusted. And then we look at the various countries in comparison to the extent in which they diverge from the expected. And so when we do that, this is one example. This is for magazines. You see that at the second line on the right. For magazines, you will see that Mexico is roughly at the line, at the horizontal line, and that means it is roughly where you would expect it to be. So in that sense, it's okay. It's kind of more or less as you would expect it. But if you go to newspapers, you will already see that Mexico is considerably more concentrated than you would expect it to be, the horizontal line. And the answer to that probably is the large media company OEM. Is that what you pronounce it? That has lots of newspapers all over the country, Seoul and so on. Okay, or if you look at wireless. Now if you look at wireless, you see that Mexico, even adjusting for income and wealth and population, all kinds of other factors, will be kind of at the second highest level of all of these countries in wireless mobile. And in wireline, Telmex is also fairly high up. And the only reason why it's not at the top is that there are many other countries where it's even more concentrated. We were surprised at that, and we went back to the authors. And so therefore, I think there was a very good observation. These numbers, the Japan number will change because they didn't use the methodology that they used was slightly incorrect. Okay, for reasons of time, here's ISPs. For reasons of time, I'm just going to stop that with a summarizing observation on this issue, which is that Mexico, in many, if not almost all of the media industries, shows a higher concentration than it should have, given its income, its population size, its educational levels, its geography, and all that. So, in that sense, though, Mexico is not totally unusual, because one of the things that we identify is that the media concentration problem has been described often as a problem of big American companies, big European companies, and so on. And in fact, if you look at it more carefully, the main problem of media concentrations are emerging countries, BRIC-type countries, Brazil and Russia and these kinds of countries, which are still developing in terms of economics and still developing in terms of democracy. And here you have the emergence of very large state companies plus the so-called crony capitalism, in which companies have relationships, media companies, symbiotic relationships with their governments, in which the government does favors for the major companies, such as licensing and approvals, and in return also gets some very favorable type coverage. And some of the criticisms that I've heard here were that things like that happen here also, and therefore but I would say it's not only here, but obviously, and some of it also in the United States, and some of it also in the UK, so it's not black and white. Nevertheless, on the spectrum, Mexico is more here rather than there. Now, okay. What countries have the largest foreign ownership of media? And foreign ownership, I know it's often described as something negative. These foreigners are telling us what to say. But actually, it is a competitive force, because it is one of the ways in which domestic strong media companies can be offset by other strong companies. So for example, let's say in Telecom, Telmex is very strong. You bring in Telefonica, which is also very strong, or Orange from France, or whatever. Those can be potential offsetting companies. And so if you look at that, you will see that Mexico is actually, when it comes to media, foreign media ownership, it is one of the lowest countries in the world, in contrast to Argentina, which is the highest of these countries, mostly because of Telecom. And one other observation, and that is the ownership of media ownership. Who are the owners of media? And I've already discussed this to some extent. They're the institutional owners, the individual owners and the state owners. And if you look at that globally, you find that approximately, on average, the individual owners owned by the large individual owners, the billionaire types, the mogul types, not the little shareholders, but the big ones of big companies, they own up to about 15–16%. Similar number for the institutional owners, a similar number for the governments. So together these three categories are about 1/2 of ownership, and the other half small individuals, small institutions, and maybe small government. But Mexico is different here, because in Mexico, as we discussed, you have almost no government ownership. And you have very little institutional ownership. In other words, the individual owners in Mexico, the families and the individuals, have a much higher proportion of overall media ownership than it is on average around the world. And so, to summarize now, the priority problems that I see in the world is that content media are becoming more concentrated, that China, Google, the problem of the developing countries and the BRICS, the problem of the internet that I described to you, the globalization problem in which the opening of markets and the internet lead to very large international media organizations that on some level tend to reduce the role and the possibilities of small media companies, although there's some exception in the other direction. The institutional ownership, which leads to absentee owners from a distance in financial centers. And lastly, the problem that regulation and public policy have a very difficult time in dealing with these new concentration issues. And so the outlook is one in which fundamentally media will become more concentrated, and yet the tools of government will become more difficult to exercise. And so this is a major challenge for all of us here, intellectually and politically. And therefore, I do thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I can just do it in English. Necessary to switch. Here, one of the things that is very important is how clear thinking, evidence-based and ideas can enrich public policy. So in the tradition of the academia, I think that this is very important at the point we are in Mexico City, in Mexico in general, when we're discussing the bill that is right now in Congress. And one of the, we'll make it very short to allow for Alex, and then because we have to end it at 12 to catch the plane, is that how complex the situation is. On the one hand, it's very clear that Mexico is very concentrated, both in broadcasting and in telecommunications. And yet, on the other hand, we also see this tendency towards a global concentration because of capital intensity. So one thing we know is that we cannot expect the market to have very many players. There will always be a limit. Having said that, and we can also see that we cannot rely on the internet to solve these problems also. So it's a very complex environment. And having said that, in Mexico, we obviously need policies to address this high concentration. And we've had advances. Sometimes it's an advance and then it is going back. But one of the big advances was last year with the reform to the Constitution in Mexico, that I think one of the elements that will help concentration go down is to have a sound, effective regulatory policy. In order to have that, first variable there is an autonomous regulatory policy. I'd like to know your thoughts about that, because the reform gave EFD very strong faculties and autonomous decisions. It left the executive out of the regulatory process in the sense of it could not influence either the decisions or the regulatory activities of the regulatory agency. This is the first time in 20 years that this has happened, and we were all very excited about that, because for the first time, Jorge Nicolini is here, and he suffered the consequences of not having the autonomy during the first stages of the open the market in Mexico. What we see now in the bill is that it's effectively curtailing this power. It's curtailing its power by having an important role for the ministry, by having the interpretation of the law be part of its role in regulation, and it's also curtailing us out by providing in this bill activities and decisions that should be left only to IFT. That includes interconnection rates and a series of decisions that should be left to the effective. So in essence, there's a big risk here involved, and I would say that what do we do now that we're here? And maybe, just put one more thing, because the power of the effective being curtailed is a very important risk for the future of the development of the sector in Mexico, both in broadcasting and in television. And the other are some provisions that are curtailing the citizens' rights, privacy and data information, that an authority can decide and can ask carriers to suspend services. This is a risk that is important for us to look at. And my last question would be in terms of, I know Americans can be critical of their system and of themselves, but I would love to have something like the FCC in Mexico with all its problems. And one of the things that they've done is not allowing a TV company to own cable companies and press and publicity. And yes, perhaps one of the problems that causes this high concentration in Mexico is precisely the vertical integration in telecommunications and in broadcasting. So just your thoughts on that.
En primer lugar, muchas gracias por la presentación. Creo que ha sido muy ilustrativa, particularmente porque nos permite ver México en un contexto más amplio, ¿no? Como siempre le digo a los estudiantes, muchas veces uno cuando se ve aquí en el Cide y se ven sufriendo, básicamente ustedes son como una pequeña parte, se ven como una muy pequeña parte de una gran distribución de población en México, ¿no? Y realmente esta es una visión que te pone en el descampado, así te da una perspectiva mucho más amplia. En segundo lugar, me alegro mucho porque hace apenas 2 días me tocó moderar un evento básicamente era sobre los 40 años también del Cide, en el contexto de discusión sobre la ley de competencia económica. Y particularmente lo que nos queríamos resaltar era establecer un diálogo, ¿no? Y la academia, en este caso el Cide, ha privilegiado permanentemente la naturaleza del diálogo, en particular Telecom Cide en el contexto regulatorio y lo que hemos ido avanzando en materia de competencia. Entonces sí se ha privilegiado y se le ha dado una voz muy atenta a invitar a personas especialistas a despolitizar este tema y hacerlo en carácter técnico. ¿Okay? Ahora, a mí me toca hablar como economista. Lo que nos ha presentado el profesor Noam es 3 elementos que son típicos en el contexto de las telecomunicaciones y la radiodifusión en el mundo y en materia de medios. En primer lugar, todos aquellos que han tomado economía conmigo se darán cuenta que tienen un elemento de lo que se llaman costos hundidos, es decir, son empresas que suponen altas cantidades de recursos, ¿okay? Que se disponen que en algunos casos van a estar pérdidas al inicio del negocio, ¿okay? No hay periodo que gane desde el principio. Luego tenemos lo que se llama costos marginales muy bajos, ¿okay? Y estas 2 características hacen típica de lo que llaman un monopolio natural, ¿okay? Un monopolio natural, yo creo que el natural se lo hemos dado nosotros. Realmente muchos de los eventos que se han visto ahí son monopolios otorgados por el Estado, ¿okay? Son licencias otorgadas por el Estado en el criterio que uno o muy pocos operadores son los que pueden ser exitosos. Un segundo elemento que es importante es la naturaleza de las redes. Estos son sectores en los cuales la gente opera por redes, es decir, tratan de comunicarse unos con otros y desean comunicarse con otros, y en la medida en que hay mayor comunicación entre las distintas redes, mejor. En la medida en que estas redes están de alguna manera segmentadas, se crea ese poder monopólico. Y de lo que se trata aquí es de establecer mecanismos de comunicación entre ellas. Para ponerles un ejemplo, y volviendo un poco a lo que ha sido la discusión yo trabajo en materia de telecomunicaciones e interconexiones de red, lo que ha sido tradicionalmente la idea de que se utilicen criterios de costos, ¿no? En materia de interconexión, es decir, lo que se llaman las tarifas de interconexión, las tarifas que se pagan entre las distintas redes para interconectarse. Hoy en día se está planteando una nueva metodología en el contexto de la nueva ley, que se refiere, por ejemplo, a la utilización de bill and keep. Pero esto se está planteando también en una transición en lo que es un modelo de regulación asimétrica, ¿okay? En el cual, en este caso, uno de los considerados preponderantes, para mí me gusta más utilizar el término dominante en el mercado. Este dominante tiene alto poder en el mercado, no hay forma de romper este poder en el mercado, y una forma de hacerlo es crearle instrumentos a los entrantes para poder competir. Un modo de competir acá es utilizando tarifas de interconexión. En un caso, por ejemplo, en el contexto de las metodologías han variado ya en el caso de la regulación asimétrica emitida por el IFT, trata de utilizar porcentajes de mercado. mientras que, por ejemplo, en un contexto aquí, como lo está planteando la ley, quiere llevarlo a cero. ¿Por qué? Porque básicamente lo que está tratando es que cada una de las redes logre homogeneizar los costos de terminación y que sean sus consumidores y que sea la empresa o el operador más competitivo que logre capturar el mayor número de agentes. ¿Okay? Pero en un contexto asimétrico, de lo que se trata en este caso es brindarle a los consumidores las mayores oportunidades de comunicarse entre ellos. Entonces, esto es, digamos, ya una política regulatoria de carácter puntual que trata de romper, digamos decir, la concentración que existe en un mercado de telecomunicaciones que normalmente caracterizamos por altos costos hundidos, costos marginales muy bajos, efectos de red, y que le cuesta a un regulador y por lo tanto tiene que tomar medidas tales como lo que representó una reforma constitucional y que en este momento estamos viendo bajo amenaza de algunos elementos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, particularmente la autonomía del IFT en el momento de dictar sus reglas. Realmente vemos este círculo de elementos económicos, elementos de un Estado que desea mantener control sobre la media, ya sea otorgando licencias, ya otorgando privilegios, y por otra parte hay otras fuerzas de mayoría liberales que tratan de abrir estos medios, ¿no? Y crear competencia. Creo que nuevamente la presentación que nos ha dado el profesor Noam ha sido muy ilustrador en términos del mundo, cómo México se sitúa en toda esta corriente, en este espectro. Y yo tengo una pregunta, y es particularmente, no ha señalado la naturaleza de la pluralidad de los contenidos, pero una cosa es que podamos tener, cierto, es tener concentración en términos medios, ¿no? Y otro es la manipulación que puede hacer que puede plantearse cualquiera de estos medios en términos de contenidos, es decir, cuán concentrados son los contenidos y cuán manipulables son esos contenidos hoy en día en un ambiente que se pretende de alta interconexión, de convergencia tecnológica.
Gracias, Alex. Me parece que vamos a abrirlo porque tenemos poco tiempo, entonces si podemos tomar algunas preguntas.
Cuando habla de concentración, bueno, a mí me parece muy interesante. Lo que estoy viendo es que cuando hay, digamos, las compañías que están volviéndose, cuando vemos el caso de España y México, totalmente transnacionales. Entonces, cuando hablo del mercado, creo que la competencia obvia no son nuevos startups, sino son los de siempre, ¿no? Vienen o Vodafone, o viene Virgin, o vienen los mismos que vemos en todos lados. Entonces, una cuestión sería que con esta apertura y disminución del dominante, o como menciona el profesor Deputado, se esté abriendo el campo para alguien que es muy parecido en su país y que se va a comportar eventualmente igual en su país, igual en los países que es oeste. Me preocupa que el dominante pierda el incentivo de calidad, y por si hacemos calidades en la red, al tener que ceder o inclusive llegar al extremo de tener que vender partes del negocio, los incentivos para la inversión pues se van eliminando. Esas serían mis dos preocupaciones, ¿no? No veo startups en este negocio, son los mismos, ya sea con cachucha de televisora o con telefónica pura o o medios impresos pues están en desaparición plena, esa no me preocupa, pero en general son los mismos, cambiando de cachucha, cambiando de país, siendo huéspedes, afectando al dominante o al incumbente y quitando incentivos económicos. Y por el otro lado, veo que todas estas compañías lo que hacen es ir comiéndose a las startups. No hay startups y cuando empiezan a ser exitosas, llega una tender offer que es bueno, el mejor dulce para
Gracias, buenos días. Profesor Noam, ya no hablemos de Japón porque ya no hay tiempo. ¿Perdón?
Pueden identificar.
Sí, soy Rubén Álvarez, periodista, director de un portal de internet que se llama Educación Futura. Ya no hay tiempo de hablar de Japón, entonces yo no le pregunto de Japón, pero sí quiero hablar sobre lo que usted dijo y me queda claro que en términos de concentración, internet es el problema, no la solución. Pero en términos de contenido, en el imaginario de quienes estamos en el medio de la comunicación, internet es la solución y tarde, en cuanto a contenido, y tarde o temprano, algo va a pasar inclusive con las networks de televisión mayores, ¿no? E internet tendría que ser la solución en términos de contenido. Decía usted que los periódicos están en franca desaparición, no lo sé. Pero lo que no está en franca desaparición es la televisión como la conocemos hasta ahora desde hace 55, 60 años o 70 años, ni la radio. Y no me parece que Internet vaya a ser la forma o el vehículo para que desaparezcan, si es que van a desaparecer, las formas convencionales de comunicación. Mucho menos por los números que estoy viendo que usted muestra de la concentración y del poder económico que hoy en día tienen en esa parte de la discusión en vilo a este país. Estamos discutiendo, no la concentración, no la estamos discutiendo la concentración, estamos discutiendo apenas a ver si hay nuevas cadenas, si esas cómo van a ser, pero no sabemos qué contenido van a dar y tampoco sabemos si va a haber algún start-up en cuanto a broadcasting que nos pueda dar nuevos contenidos o diferentes contenidos.
Thank you very much for these very outstanding comments, which I will now try to respond to in the next 45 minutes. First there was the issue of the Autonomous Regulatory Commission, and on the model of the FCC in Washington and of Ofcom in London, the various European independent regulators in Europe, which has been a trend in recent years. But I think it mostly came from the FCC, in fact, because most of the European and Japanese and some countries have these ministries that were in charge. The problem with ministries is that ministries are part of the executive and therefore they are political. Inevitably, therefore, the politics and the media intervene in each other. It's not good for the media, it's not good for the government to have this symbiotic relationship. And so therefore, it is important in the field of media with free speech, where you want to have as little government interference as possible. But some is probably necessary, sometimes for these reasons of these natural monopoly characteristics, that at least it will be as much removed, instead of totally removed, but as much removed as possible from the political sphere. Now, so countries go through various iterations of this. And we have the distinguished commissioner of the COFICOM, the preceding agency, and what we see is that institutions are kind of changing and reforming, and one has lessons and one kind of creates new structure. What my meetings at the IFT showed me was just looking at the biographies of these commissioners. It is really an extraordinarily high professional group of people, which are, in fact, purely on the biographical level, superior to what we have in Washington, where it is much more political. But the institution itself has more of a tradition of being removed from the political sphere. And it has done so reasonably successfully. Now, the natural monopoly issue is in fact quite correct. For a while, people hoped that Telecom, there would be multiple companies, but then the economies of scale eventually prevail. And so what does one do in that situation? Well, one of them is that globalization that was discussed here, which is that you take other strong incumbents, I believe we made that point, strong incumbents from Spain, from other countries, and because they already have the scale, and they are therefore able to do what the startups cannot do. It's not an ideal solution. It's a second best, third best solution, but it's certainly better than doing nothing. So the opening, I think, is an important factor. And in fact, the opening has to go in both directions. And for Mexico, it has been going in both directions. The company, Telmex, American Movie, is a major player in other countries too, and is therefore a pro-competitive force in other countries, and so therefore it's only logical there should be some symmetrical type arrangements here, and to some extent there are, just not as much. People have been thinking, well, suppose we have a big company called Carso, Slim, basically, and then there's Televisa, and so why not just kind of have them compete against each other to solve that problem? And that seems kind of, at first blush, to be kind of an attractive proposition, but since you're an economist, you will recognize the prisoner dilemma problem here. So if you have two companies and they kind of go compete with each other, at first they will drive each other down. After a while, they will conclude that it is much better to collaborate, to cooperate tacitly or explicitly. And so eventually, you will probably have much less of that kind of vigorous competition. So that really has to come from some outsiders. And at the same time, I think the logic then would suggest, in the case of strong participants, that you want to have that vertical integration is a problem because economists don't believe very much in vertical integration. That is dominant. But there is one exception. The exception is if it's an extension of monopoly power into another stage that is competitive. In their structural regulation of separation, of kind of divestiture, of interconnection arrangements, of pricing arrangements, of neutrality arrangements, has always been the case. Next is the pluralism aspect that was described. Pluralism of content is a content as opposed to market structure is a very laudable goal. And so ideally we would not look into which companies are large but are all, and which ones are small, but other viewpoints, all viewpoints are represented. Do we have enough left? Do we have enough right? Do we have center? Do we have enough Islamists? Do we have enough Marxists? Whatever. But the problem is that while it is in principle a laudable idea, it is operationally almost impossible to define what is left, what is right. For example, in America, the Catholic Church is in favor, is against the death penalty, which is a liberal position, but it is also against abortion, which is a conservative policy. So a newspaper that kind of reflects that line, is it a liberal or is it a conservative thing? So operationally it becomes almost impossible to do. And if a government agency is involved in the business of defining we don't have enough left papers, we have too much right-wing papers, that would bring government into the media field in an almost impossible way. So I think it's the openness that has to govern rather than the balancing, trying to balance in too detailed a form. Kind of how this would proceed. That plus, I will make one exception, a public broadcasting system, a public service broadcasting system on the model of BBC or ARD or RAI or so on that exists in particular in European countries, so NHK in Japan, would permit the various political groupings to have an entry into television in ways that do not exist. Because in some ways, Mexico is really unusual in that it doesn't have government public, that is public broadcasting and public service broadcasting. I understand the history and I understand also the problems that could emerge by a particular political party capturing such an institution. If it is set up in the correct way, it would have acted a pluralism model. So I think that there were several more points made, but I probably should just stop and we have some other comments that we can come back if necessary.
quería simplemente hacer un punto sobre el comentario que se señaló. En el contexto de la posibilidad de entrada, ¿okay? Sabemos que existen desde el punto de vista regulatorio instrumentos que pueden posibilitar eso. Para la redundancia, en particular hemos visto la regulación asimétrica que está tratando de imponer el IFT. Creo que es el camino correcto. El punto es hacer énfasis sobre algunos de esos instrumentos. Desde el punto de vista de la teoría, digamos, de la academia, sabemos que hay instrumentos más idóneos que otros en el momento de permitir, porque lo que se trata es dotar instrumentos a los entrantes para poder competir, tratando de aliviar las barreras a la competencia que existen. En este caso, las barreras a la competencia son muy naturales que existen, que son economías de redes, costos hundidos muy fuertes, es decir, lo que se llama monopolio natural. Entonces, por ejemplo, la tarifa de interconexión, mientras más asimétrica sea, le estoy dando mayor posibilidad a un entrante de poderse colocar. En cambio, por ejemplo, una regulación off-net on-net pudiera, en todo caso, crear incentivos perversos porque no promueve la competencia, es decir, no hace que el entrante se ponga a competir, ¿okay? Lo que está atándole las manos al grande. Y lo que necesitamos es crear esos instrumentos para que el entrante pueda competir y pueda competir en las mejores condiciones.
Pues muchísimas gracias, profesor Noam. Yo creo que esta es una discusión que debemos de continuar, ¿no? Aún después de las leyes secundarias. Y sí me parece que reitero un poco que la importancia del diseño, del proceso de diseño e implementación regulatoria, que debe ser abierta y esta autonomía a la IFT, incluso en el caso que coincido que la regulación de tarifas asimétricas es un buen camino, pero debe ser determinada por la IFT, no en la ley secundaria. Yo creo que continuaremos en el Cide incluyendo a la industria, a la academia, a los reguladores en esta discusión. Ciertamente es importante la promulgación de estas leyes secundarias para las acciones regulatorias y bueno, estaremos observando y continuando el debate. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Professor Mariscal, Professor Vitar, and all of you are here. And you should understand that how privileged you are, I think, to have this in Mexico, this close relation of academia and regulators, and press, and political actors. It is a kind of a very exceptional system internationally, and I'm very happy to have come here and participated at least a little bit in it. Thank you.
Ya terminó el paquete.
Exactamente eso. Y luego salieron en enero otros. Entonces ahí está. Ah, sí. De hecho, yo también lo conseguí. ¿Sabes qué? Más que nada, cuando ya no tengan unas solicitudes al show, si lo damos muy tarde, no vamos a dar. Pero ¿sabes qué? Nada más saca los dos listados. Los debes de tener hasta en tu correo, porque yo te mandé el segundo, te puse la segunda base de la cruzada. Entonces ahí lo vamos a hacer.